about the permeable reactive barriers. I think it will be really valuable to have an expert from Stantec whose job is to install these things on a regular basis come in and do a workshop. I think that's a great suggestion. I just wanted to leave you with a point, which is, from that EPA workshop, this company that I started to talk about, their removal of perchlorate it's an oxidation reduction reaction. And so before you can actually remove perchlorate, you actually have to remove nitrogen species. And the point that I wanted to make that sort of got lost in our conversation was that for every gas tank that's leaked where they're removing the perchlorate, they've taken out nitrogen species. So the idea that nitrogen has been removed using these PRB. And what PRB is a carbon source. So what we're actually injecting is a source of carbon. And the reaction that happens in a PRB is exactly what happens in a denitrifying septic system. You've got it's bacteria that are given a carbon source that allows them to denitrify, which is what they need to be able to take that biological step. And it's the same step that's used in this perchlorate reduction. But first you remove nitrogen species. And so I think when we have a more a dedicated technical session, we can kind of get into how the chemistry works and the kinds of media that we're talking about and the familiarity that the PRB industry has with mitigating different, in this case, Superfund hazardous chemicals, but that nitrogen species are part of that process. They're just not the end game, so they're not recorded as such. And with that, we'll talk some more about PRBs. Next is aquaculture, and in an effort to get everything done in an hour, I'm going to go to what are the constraints and limitations. The upside you can see in these lovely pictures. We relayed last year 1 million or so oysters into West Falmouth Harbor, and we're harvesting them this year. So we've been running demonstrations. We had a big party on Saturday, and I have to say, it was the most positive community event. It was a real family-oriented, all ages, people that have never shellfished. So everybody seems to like the shellfish. It's a very friendly kind of a pursuit, but there are a bunch of problems, and the problems are what happens if your crops fail. It's farming, and that's the key question. Where can you grow actual oysters or cohogs or a combination? What happens when you have climate change and acidity, ocean acidification? Do people want to look at gear? In some places, people are happy to look at gear. In other places, they do not want to look at gear. So you have to be very specific with gear-based aquaculture to site them in places where people are going to like looking at the gear, and that you can keep the growing paradigm. I guess you can grow the right amount, not too much and not too little, so that you've mitigated your risk of if you have crop failures. I think the other question is this question of reefs, which are very, in this area because we're so close to Wellfleet, and Wellfleet has been having such great success growing reefs. We want to think about reefs, but the real question is, can you actually get wild culture to grow? And for that, you do need to do some viability testing, and that's what you do when you think about aquaculture. I'm rushing through the steps to implementation. But the idea is first you put some culture out and you see if the waters will support an aquaculture program. As is the case with the other non-traditional technologies, you need to have somebody running your aquaculture project that really knows what they're doing, that they're problem solvers. They can be a little bit predictive about risk. They're not waiting for the weather to kill off their oysters. They're watching. And there's lots you can do as a farmer to move your crops so that when a big storm comes in, they don't get silted over. But you have to be that kind of a manager. You have to be a problem solver. You have to be proactive. You have to watch what's going on. And we've got a great propagation manager in Falmouth that I can really work with. He basically thinks about things ahead of time, but I can call him anytime and he's available and in it. So I think with aquaculture, there are the opportunities that we've actually identified and field verified actually already are where these limitations are not an issue. But it's not going to work everywhere, and it's not going to work for hundreds of acres. So what are your thoughts about aquaculture? Oh, come on.
Well, I think one of the other questions, constraints, is just the seasonal aspect of it. I mean, obviously, you spoke earlier about planning for catastrophic events, catastrophic weather events, but also the seasonality of the uptake of nitrogen and how you might address that.
That's a really good question. Now, when we talk about the nitrogen numbers, and we do, the idea is that a full-grown quahog or a full-grown oyster is taking up a certain number of kilograms. And that is during its seasonal growth. So if I'm saying that a million oysters takes up 260 kilograms of nitrogen, it's done it in its growing season. So it is a mass number that does get taken up in a shorter period of time, but the TMDL isn't really a daily load. I mean, I think it's important to understand that you're not putting in, 1.6 kilograms a day of nitrogen into these water bodies. It comes in sort of bursts. And the problem is actually a seasonal problem. So you can have a lot more nitrogen in February because of the temperatures. You don't get algae blooms. And then there's a flushing, and some of these ponds are flushed in 2 days. So the winter problem isn't a problem. So there's almost a value to the peaking of pulling out the nitrogen and filtering the phytoplankton, which is a really important aspect of shellfish aquaculture, whether it's in a reef or it's in bags, the water clarity. They actually eat the phytoplankton. They're eating what we hate. And so that's a really big benefit in terms of the seasonality. But the numbers work just on the arithmetic does work that way too.
I have a question. You showed a diagram in your handout about how many pounds of kilograms of nitrogen, but there was no time. Is that per season, per year, or what?
That is per 3-inch organism, and
yeah, but
I did
over
give
what period of time?
Oysters are, and I think I put that in the text. An oyster takes 2 growing seasons to get to 3 inches plus, and a quahog in Falmouth they're taking 2 years. And the historical information from Orleans from the McFarland paper is that it was more like 3 or 4. So quahogs take longer to grow, and oysters seem to be growing faster. But you'd want to measure. I unequivocally 2 years for 17 months is what we heard in the field for getting harvest oysters. I think quahogs we'd want to test. It might take longer.
Okay, so this is to grow till it gets to 2.5 or 3 inches. That's what these numbers are for. It's to over that period to
yes.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you. Well, the other thing, one other comment too is. From a design viewpoint, it seems as though if you know pretty carefully what the number of grams is removed per oyster or quahog, it seems straightforward to design a system that you know exactly how much it's going to be taken out, provided they don't get killed with disease or storms or predators or whatever.
And you can mitigate that. There's this idea of a monoculture versus companion planting. And the idea is if there's a real aversion to risk, in other words, if you want to make sure that you don't have a die-off period, you'd probably want to have oysters in some other species, like mussels, just as your backup plan, and you'd want to have them in 2 separate areas, and some on the bottom and some on the top. So that can all be designed, as you say, once you know what your filter's doing. Yeah, they're filters.
Judith. I think in Orleans we love our bivalves, and I've never heard anybody get upset about aquaculture or the gear. I'd be very surprised if that were an issue in town. Maybe it is, but I've never really heard it. Conflicts with recreation might be. I mean, if that increased to a level where people felt they could no longer sail, use their boats, fish, etc., because of aquaculture, then there probably would be. With the aquaculture, though, I believe that to actually remove the nitrogen, the critter has to be removed. As long as the critter stays in the water, it will eventually die, and that nitrogen simply gets recycled. So if you're going to be removing the nitrogen, I think it's got to be based on your harvest.
I guess a couple of points about that. There are, the harvest is a very easy, clear pathway. Denitrification, and I've read the studies, and there's a large range between, twice the amount of nitrogen removal to 5 times or 10 times the amount of nitrogen removal to no nitrogen removal for denitrification. But the point is that that particular pathway, and what it is the pseudofeces that come out of the bivalve go into the sediment, and because of the bacterial activity, create the denitrification step. And that can be significant. And so what they're looking at when they look at oyster reefs and no-take zones is much of the removal of nitrogen is that denitrification aspect. That would have to be, in my opinion, verified on a site-specific basis. What we're doing in our projects in Falmouth and what they're actually doing, I think, in Wellfleet, is they're actually doing core samples to determine what the denitrification rates are, so you have real numbers, not theoretical numbers from the Chesapeake. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is it is not clear if you leave an oyster reef in place, the oyster itself becomes substrate for other oysters. And so you are keeping an oyster, but you're growing more oysters by keeping it there than just by harvesting it out. And so the idea of a reef ecosystem that is not that's a no-take zone, that you can absolutely see that you don't have to remove the oysters or the clams to have real nitrogen removal benefits. But in those particular cases, the water quality monitoring is critical. If you can count your oysters, you've got your number. If you can't count your oysters, you're going to have to start looking at upstream water quality, in-stream water quality, and downstream, and check that gradient and see. But I do think that both have merit as nitrogen-removing pathways.
Okay, thank you.
Is, in Falmouth, the propagation manager, is Falmouth doing this all themselves, or are they relying upon private growers?
We're doing it all ourselves.
Okay. And that's, when you're doing these numbers here, because I think the original matrix projected a cost of 0 associated with aquaculture, which presumed it would be done by private players, or was that cost based upon the sale of the oysters? How do you factor the cost in here?
All of the above. I think we have the numbers for if the town's doing a propagation program, which is really very helpful. I mean, we've got, I know what it costs. I mean, I've watched it for a couple of years. I do the budgets. I track the money. So we can know what it takes for the town to grow a couple million, 3 million oysters. If it's private, that's a different paradigm, and there are different regulatory constraints on private growing versus municipal propagation programs that we'd want to weigh. And now we're getting into the details of implementation. And I'm trying to keep us at 500 feet. So, but the economics change based on how you do it. But it could be private, and it would be less expensive.
All right, I have Jeff, I have Doug, I have Sandy, and then Karen. So Jeff.
Well, the reef solution obviously creates the biodiversity that you speak of, and it brings in not only the bivalve species, but others, crabs, etc., finfish. It supports other species, and it's important from that aspect. And in any of these aquaculture or reef solutions, they restore natural ecosystem services that were operating in the water body once upon a time, which is an additional benefit to the shorter time frame, et cetera. And it's important because those natural ecosystem services, removing nitrogen is one thing, but the natural ecosystem services are also going to benefit the sediment quality and the water quality directly, which are over and above the value you get out of nitrogen reduction. And they move us towards the end game, which is water quality and habitat restoration in the water system.
And there's an artificial distinction, honestly, and I think it's in the technology matrix, and we've carried it over here. You've got, it's a continuum. You've got aquaculture, reefs, and then this category called coastal habitat restoration. And we've made those separate categories. When I talk about aquaculture, I'm really thinking about gear-based aquaculture, where you're growing a monoculture and harvesting it or bottom planting it or propagating it in some way for harvest by the community. I mean, that's aquaculture as defined. The coastal habitat restoration and the reefs are exactly that, and that's the difference, that even though you're not taking the species out, you're creating all these ancillary benefits, and if the fish are, if something is eating something else and swimming away, you've removed the nitrogen that way. So we're going to talk about coastal habitat restoration next.
But you've also got, you talk about the gear and whatnot, or if you put in a reef, you're going to have to dedicate some area to that. The problem in a lot of these water systems is that we've modified the water system and changed it the way we want it. And we've disturbed the natural ecosystem services, and the idea comes up that, well, maybe somebody will object to not being able to use this area or that area. I think we've got to get over that, because if we want to recover the water quality and the sediment quality in the system, we're going to have to go somewhere in the direction of creating what was naturally, the way things naturally operated. And we're going to have to make some compromises about having it our way or having it nature's way.
In the draft paper we received, you mentioned the Virginia Oyster Garden model. That's
Yes.
a possible model for Orleans. Will we be looking at that? Will we get more data on that?
No.
Have we done that already and I missed it, or what?
I think when we get to implement, when we get to each of our watersheds, which we will, and I probably make 5 minutes or so, I think I need to hear, we need to hear from you guys about where you want to implement, where you want to look at implementing non-traditional solutions. I've tried to take each sub-watershed to a point where I think you could do it this way or this way or this way, but ultimately, if you think that's the right model versus an oyster reef versus some gear-based commercial, you got to sort of tell us at some level what you want to see.
Where do we go to learn about that one?
The Virginia Oyster Garden.
Just Google it.
You could just Google it, or I could tell you very briefly that it's the idea that residents put certain bags of oysters on their docks and in their yard. I mean, that's the idea, that it's very much a decentralized residential dock owner approach. But I think the question is the numbers. So the first thing we have to say is, how many oysters do we need in this watershed to get the kind of nitrogen reduction we need? And then we have to think about the most practical way to get that number of bags, or that number of reef, or that number of coastal habitat restoration in the ground.
Sandy. This is 10,000 feet. Can freshwater mussels be used in ponds to remove nitrogen? And phosphorus particularly. Has that ever been done, or could it be done?
I have not heard of it at all, but I have heard about the analog, which are these floating constructed wetlands that have much more data in freshwater systems and lagoons, that when we're talking about the freshwater ponds, that's something I thought would be worth. I think that aquaculture and permeable reactive barriers on the spectrum of how much we know and how much science there is behind it and how sort of tried and tested they are on one end. And I think the floating constructed wetlands, which are, I think, next, are way on the other end. I mean, that is a demonstration project that needs to happen. But if they work in the order of magnitude that they're reported to work, that would be a good freshwater solution. But I'm getting ahead of us, and maybe I should.
Yeah, we're going to try and get there.
Just quickly, I know there's been a lot of reference to oysters. In Pleasant Bay, there isn't really a natural oyster set, and there's been, limited, historical attempts at growing oysters, some not so successful. And I noticed, at least in the earlier plan you had submitted, there was an oyster reef proposed, I think, near the Poche area. you know, what goes into assessing the likely success of oysters, given that there's not a real historical precedent?
Great question. The first, one of the reasons why the Pushy area was recommended is because there's highly successful oyster growing right around the bend. So the shellfish grants that are out right now, they've all transitioned to oysters. And we happened, when we were out on Friday, to see one of the growers out there who was sort of beaming and saying that he, I don't think I'll report his number, but he's pulling a lot of oysters out of a pretty small grant. And so the oysters are doing really well right there at the head of Barley's. The Aries Pond project that the Orleans Pond Coalition, those oysters are growing very well. They have an upweller at the marina. They're growing them in bags. They're relaying them out into Mill Pond, and they actually grow very well in Mill Pond. They just get eaten by other creatures, so there's a predation problem there. So those oysters are growing. That's a picture of a quahog. and I put that up there very explicitly because I think quahog propagation would make a lot of sense in some of the other coastal ponds because that's a native population. And up in Poche, you've got razor clams and softshell clams that might be something to continue propagating as well. So in the areas where I talk about the coastal habitat restoration, I'm very much thinking about more species that are more wild growing in those areas. But that's a great question.
I do a lot of shell fishing, and I live in the town cove, and for every quahog I pull up, I must pull up 50 oyster shells. So at one time, I don't know when, but there was a hell of a lot of oysters in the town cove. So I don't know if the conditions are right now to let them grow, but at one time they did grow. I just wanted to put that in as a comment.
That is great information. Okay,
Can we?
we are.
Okay.
So here we are at coastal habitat, which is the other, I'm just going to write oysters in Congo. This is going to be a really brief conversation because we've just had it. It's the continuum between are you growing it in bags or are you trying to restore a habitat that includes native species and maybe some planted species and trying to do exactly what you were saying about the natural systems were cleaning up our waters, and then we started polluting the waters, and the natural systems died. And so the idea of coastal habitat restoration is bringing back the systems that were there doing a really valuable job before they were wrecked. And I think the jury's out a little bit on can you restore that kind of an ecosystem, and will it sustain? Will it be an ecosystem that you can keep alive even though the water has changed? And the way the 208 matrix describes it, there's a shellfish component to that coastal habitat restoration, which is where some of the nitrogen, the real nitrogen removal is coming from. But again, we'd be looking for specific areas, and we've identified specific areas, and when we were boating around, we found areas where it looked like we could restore existing systems with some care and then watch them and see if they kept going. So that's coastal habitat. I'm going to move to floating constructed. We got a couple more. Floating constructed wetlands. This is sort of what they look like. So this is a very optimistic set of numbers that are out there right now for the floating constructed wetlands. And I didn't change the numbers that were in the technology matrix because that wouldn't have been fair for me to say it's half or a tenth or 50, whatever, because the information is mostly from freshwater systems. So what we've really looked at in what I've seen and the papers that I've read are mostly from freshwater systems. I've talked to there's a company called Floating Islands. They're doing a demonstration in Martha's Vineyard right now. They started last year. It was sort of their kickoff. They're going to be monitoring again this year. And I think it would be very worthwhile to look at those actual numbers that they're going to be getting out of their demonstration project before making final determinations. But the upside of this particular technology is its aesthetics, that it starts to look like systems, and I've got a picture actually later, that you could make a floating island system look like a bunch of the systems, the grass systems you've already got out there growing. So it would be aesthetically very sort of continuous with what's there now. And if the nitrogen benefits are as good as reported, they're really a home run. But the real question is, do they do what they're reported to do? And the theory behind it is that you've got grasses growing that have root systems. And the root system is really just a substrate for on the outside the nitrifying bacteria, and as you get closer into the core, you've created a denitrification zone because it's anoxic, and it is in that zone that the bacteria are working, and that's as much as has been reported that I could find. So if anybody has questions or thoughts.
I would just really like to understand it better. What is it made out of? And what is it,
Okay.
what's the medium that these things are growing in? And what are the plants that go in there?
The media, they're porous, sort of spongy, recycled, sort of not really plastic, not really rubber. They're sort of a spongy plastic.
Okay.
And you plant them, and you can plant them with whatever species you want for your ecosystem. So grasses is what I would recommend. But you can, in other places, they put flowering plants and trees even, I've seen. And then they grow. And again, the root system goes into the water. And it is, for the best that I can understand, it's the root system that is both uptaking nitrogen for plant growth and creating these bacterial zones for nitrification and denitrification.
So is this at the shore and the roots are going down into the soil, or
No,
this is
they're
strictly
suspended in the water. This is a pretty
Out
good
in the
picture.
Think like an
Okay.
earth box.
When it turns to winter in a non-growing season, why do not these roots and everything just die, go back down, and recycle into the sediments? I mean, that's basically what happens in our freshwater ponds now. We've got great water lilies and other vegetation, and they grow beautifully in June through August, and that's great. It's uptaking all the nutrients, and then you get to this time of
Add it all
year,
back in. when
and they all die, and they fall to the bottom, and it becomes a giant compost pile, and it recycles back into the sediments.
Right. And in this case, you harvest it, unless,
So you harvest them out, so you do remove them, because the material that went out said you don't pull them out in the winter. They stay in the
the
year-round.
actual facility, the system, the growing substrate actually stays in. And
So the structure stays in, but all the material comes out?
that is my understanding.
Okay.
As I understand it, you're removing the nitrogen as nitrogen gas on the inside of the root system, isn't that?
That is also, yes.
That's not what,
No, but there's also a mass of nitrogen,
No, I
and she's
understand.
absolutely right about that. So you're doing both. I don't think we know enough without having seen a demonstration. This is, like I said, I feel pretty comfortable with the permeable reactive barriers and the aquaculture and eco toilets, which we'll get to, and some other things to really know. But I think this is an emerging technology. And I think it's absolutely worth looking at because of the purported potential of it. But this is where I'd like to see an expert come in.
This is kind of, to me, a good emerging technology, because it's one that seems like do no harm.
Yeah.
It's not a problem. I mean, short of the plants you're using, you want to make sure that there's nothing that's non-native that's in there.
No invasive species
No
growing on.
invasives, and no non-natives even.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
They'll come in by themselves, though.
they might, but we don't need to give them help.
Right.
But aside from that, I don't see a downside.
No, I mean, and the upside is huge. It's really almost, too good to be true. If you actually calculate out based on their nitrogen removal, it's sort of like, wow, an acre could clean up the world, which to me is a little sort of like, really? But I think it'd be worth checking out. I honestly do.
What happens when there's ice in?
Stacy, go ahead.
What about the ice? I see you have some of these proposed from freshwater ponds, and also, would these scour the bottom in places where there's tides?
I don't know. What do you mean by scouring the bottom of this?
Well, in Pochi, for instance, there's not much water in there. If you had one in that area.
Right, and we don't actually have one in Pochi.
Well, I see one is proposed.
I think we were talking about coastal habitat restoration, but we're going to get to that hopefully soon.
I'm not reading this one. But, yeah, that's coastal, yeah.
Yeah, I
Sorry.
didn't.
But
One more, and then.
Are there places other than Martha's Vineyard where this is done, I'll say north of the Mason-Dixon line? I've Googled
Yes.
and I have found places in South Carolina and so on, but I haven't seen much to date.
There's one, Maryland. They have done one in a harbor that I recently looked at. And the most recent one is Lake Champlain, but I've got to call into the company that's doing that one, but I haven't gotten a response yet.
So saltwater or freshwater?
Fresh water.
Freshwater.
And well, the one in Maryland is in a harbor, so that is actually saltwater. And they're doing grasses
And the one in Martha's Vineyard is?
in the saltwater,
Saltwater.
in a bunch of the harbors. All right, next, eco toilets. I'm going to go right to the net of eco toilets. One is we really need to look at the kilogram removal numbers. If we're going to start using the eco toilet as a solution in Orleans, which I will point to the public acceptance. Do people want eco toilets? I'm not going to pass judgment. You guys are going to tell me whether you like eco toilets or not. But I think that is the threshold concern. Do people want to install these in their house? They do not self-install. They're not free to install. If you have one bathroom, you're probably going to be a very easy installation. If you've got 2 bathrooms, you're probably on the margin. And if you have 3 bathrooms, you are looking, who here has remodeled their bathroom? Okay, that's what we're talking about with eco toilets. They're a plumbing change, and they are complicated. And complicated, all that means is expensive. It just means it starts to cost a bunch of money when you're doing it. But the other issue is that there are, so a guy named Everett wrote a wonderful book that I read in high school and then I read in college called The Diffusion of Innovation. And he's the guy that coined the phrase early adopter. All right? So there is absolutely a percent of any population, and I bet you Orleans is the same, that are early adopters. And it's about 1 to 5%. And there are people that want the change. And the point would be if you've got 1 to 5%, maybe 0.5%, I'm looking at the selectmen over there, that we don't have too many early adopters in here in Orleans, but we might. And so the idea would be, these look like regular toilets. They operate like regular toilets in many regards. Enough said about that. The point I wanted to make is that the nitrogen numbers, we need to sort of close the loop of when we start calculating, because the Tech Matrix has 6 kilograms per year removal from an eco toilet. And I would just urge that when we start looking at this a little more carefully, that number may go down. We have to work on that a little bit. So,
Isn't there other stuff in the house other than just the toilet though?
well, this is a urine diverting toilet, and so all you'd have is a tank outside. You still need, on the first one, you still need your septic system. So an eco toilet doesn't remove your septic system. So anything you're going to do with that particular technology, means you still have a septic system. And if you have a composting toilet, you need to either have a bin in your basement that collects the compost, or you need to have a system. Sometimes they're located right underneath the toilet. Sometimes they're located remotely. But yes, and you guys got an exhaustive description of eco toilets in the Tech Matrix. So I'm not going to go over those details. Sorry.
So I was just going to say, we do in fact have one resident in town that does have a urine diverting toilet and has had it for many years. So there may be more potential. I think in general, acceptance is a problem with these, and people aren't going to be fast to jump in and replumb their houses and put aside the space under the toilet that's needed for the composting and all these other things.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that something like this we should be looking at as providing perhaps a complete pass on anything on property tax to do with wastewater costs for anyone who is willing to put in eco toilets and a gray water system. I think we can provide some motivation to people that while it may not be something that we're going to force them to do or that we think that people would jump all over, if we provide the motivation, you might get some of these first, what was the term?
Early adopters.
Early adopters,
Have you
thank
heard
you.
of Falmouth's
Yes.
Eco Toilet
Yes.
Betterment
Yes.
Exemption
I
Program?
have, and I don't think that they're jumping all over it.
Yeah.
They might in.
Two, okay. All right.
2 out of 1,200. That was the answer.
You put it
I
out
run the
there,
program,
you
and
put it out there, and some people might do it.
and some people might do it.
And so give them motivation to want to do it.
It's a great program, and it really allows people to make that choice themselves.
And rather than retrofitting, this would seem to be something that could be encouraged for new development. Because, some of us have two-story homes with 3 bathrooms.
Right.
So you say that's a problem.
It's complicated and
Um,
expensive to
But if you're building a new home, you might decide on a design that would be much more adaptable and usable for this kind of thing. I don't know how you approach that to a town or new residents coming in or whatnot, but it's
You can
something.
put it under
that
land use
players-
controls.
Mhm.
Yeah, give it to them, I agree, that's great.
Center, yeah, where it's already set up, there's like 15 of them, so you can run through all different shapes and sizes and all type systems. Also in Wellfleet at the Audubon, they have them working, I love it, they use it, it's been every year.
Well, that's, at some point, there was conversation about public facilities might be more amenable.
Right, and we do have a demonstration in the schools as a place to start showing how this technology works. And on the other, I think, noteworthy point is that I've been working with Kohler for the past year, and they're actually designing an American-made urine diverting toilet that is a floor. It takes some of the features, like from installing a bunch of these, you start to realize what form factor changes should happen to make it easier to install and make it cheaper for the plumbing. And so Kohler and I have been working together to come up with an American-made version. And a key factor is having the urine diverting part be a waterless urinal, as opposed to some sort of a micro flush, just from a clogging perspective. So I think you should give people the opportunity and try to build a toilet that's easier to install.
But with the urine diverting, you're still having to deal with the feces, and you're still having to deal with the urine. It's just that it's in a tank, but you still have to haul it away and treat it.
Yes.
It doesn't go away.
No, it does not. No, it does not. Okay, innovative alternative septic systems. I don't think there's too much to say about these. You have them in Orleans. You ought to be familiar with them in Orleans. The nitrogen removal rates are 50% by standards, and the industry is evolving to the point where you may be able to, in the recent future, be able to see down maybe 12, 13 milligram per liter, so that's 75, 80% reduction. You still have to have a septic system. You still have to have septage that you pump out. The maintenance costs and the ongoing, at our technology monitoring subcommittee meeting, one of the issues that came that George Heufelder, who runs the test center, did is he came up with costs for monitoring for these kinds of systems. And if you take away the total suspended solids and you're just looking for nitrogen, it's still a couple of $1,000s a year for the monitoring cost, just to make sure that they're in compliance, according to George. So there are those issues, briefly.
There's a commercial system, there's an operating system in West Road that's treating about 3,600 gallons a day. It's operating at 6 parts per million, been running for 10 years. The discharge is 6 parts per million. I've gone through all the data for the 10 years and plotted out. I showed you actually.
Yep, those are cluster systems. I'm actually talking about the on-site individual. When I'm talking about these.
Okay. But you mentioned 2,000, or was it less than 2,000?
That was the cost for monitoring, not gallons.
Must have misread. Sorry.
And maybe I'll just skip over land use control. I won't skip over land use controls, but I have given you a bunch of information on the land use and the build-out analysis because you brought it up last time as an important factor. So I will just sort of turn your attention to the fact that you do have a build-out. This is from your comprehensive wastewater management plan, and they did a great job incorporating the planning department's build-out analysis into future flow calculations, and they're not insignificant. And so one of the things we want to do when we're looking at the specific sub-watersheds is reference back to what some of the build-out numbers are, and when you're looking at non-traditional technologies, try to think about which ones remove future load as well. And an IA system and an eco-toilet and some of the on-site solutions don't, where PRBs and you can scale aquaculture too.
That's an interesting question about build-out, because when the original CWMP was approved in 2008, it assumed, and Mike Iggy's here, I think, someplace, so maybe he can comment on it, he assumed there was going to be an increase of 30%. And what actually happened in in the 2010 census was there was a reduction of 7% in town. And they updated again in 2012. There was another percent reduction. So there are a lot of numbers floating around. I think we really need to look at some of these build-out numbers, how realistic they are. And maybe they can be part of this risk assessment, Mike, that we do when we look at some of these things. Just a comment.
Okay, sure.
Question, so is your methodology here that you would look at that future growth potential and just try to figure out what non-traditional systems could be used to reduce the nitrogen generated by this new growth? Or are you looking at new growth controls to reduce the number of future potential dwelling units as a way of reducing future nitrogen load?
Yes, I think the answer to that is both. And I think that the point that I was, by bringing that information to you, that those numbers are from the town planner. So that's the town planner's summary of the build-out, and they did a fairly extensive review.
Yeah, they did a great job.
They did a great job. And I think the point is to be aware of those numbers, and if there are land use control, I mean, the whole idea of, coming from a planning background, right? Land use controls require zoning changes and overlay districts and transfer of development rights. There's lots of different tools, but they have to be the town's, they have to be part of the town's planning effort. And so the question would be, from a wastewater management perspective, is that a foray into growth management, or are we just going to deal with the potential and the future loads? I think I'm throwing the question back to you guys. There's lots of ways to control growth. The question is that part of what we're doing here?
So if there are extras of the handouts to pass back that way, as long as you all have them.
I'm going to repeat myself one more time, and that's, if we're going to use non-traditional technologies, you're going to have funding, you're going to have management, and you're going to have monitoring. And with that, let's talk about the bookends. We handed out pictures of these, reminding you that these are, this is a thought experiment of an extreme. We're only using non-traditional solutions. That's it. So it's not a complete plan in the sense that we didn't look at any of the traditional. The initial focus is regulatory compliance for nitrogen, and the priority freshwater ponds are now in there, as you can see in the end. And what I want to do is go through these with you. You saw them last week. I ground truthed them and added a few things. And I want to find out what you want to do to modify them, and what other technical assessments are needed to incorporate some of these non-traditional measures. If you want to take some of them off the table completely, this is sort of a Stacy moderated discussion. But let's talk about what you think.
Before we go there, again, I'm just going to, given our time constraints, do we want to change the order to prioritize in some way, just because we may run out of time before we get through them all?
Sure.
So I would just want to put this out to the group. Should we just go through them and get as far as we can get, or do people want to start in the middle somewhere?
Some of them, this Aries, I think we should just go top to bottom, because some of them are really easy, like Aries Pond. Aries Pond to me, and I ground truth it, is a perfect demonstration site for aquaculture, because it's a boat basin. There's actually room. We verified that you could get, 1 million oysters growing in there pretty handily. It would actually remove all of the nitrogen that you need. It's a very small amount of nitrogen. It's 141 kilograms per year. The Shellfish Aquaculture Project could actually do it. I think we should look at a traditional option, next week and see what that would look like. But this is about as close as you can get to a perfect non-traditional location for a very simple technology as you can. It wouldn't matter that the bottom is anoxic because the bags are floating. And I guess the other, whoops, the other sort of key point is it's a busy boat basin, and we thought about, and we are recommending looking at conservation moorings as well, because right now the regular moorings just churn up the muck. I talked to SMAST about whether conservation moorings would get you benthic flux credit reduction, and they said no, because the conservation moorings really help keep the ecosystem. You know, if you're killing eelgrass because your moorings are scouring the bottom, that's when you put conservation moorings in, you can get ecosystems benefit. It's anoxic muck in areas right now, and so what the conservation moorings will do is will just keep that muck from getting suspended, but they weren't sure that the benthic flux number, so the amount of nitrogen, would actually change. So that's Aries Pond. What did I miss?
I just have a devil's advocate question. What if you want more filter feeders to have more food? Isn't stirring up the muck on the bottom a good thing?
It's not food.
Okay.
Silt.
That's one of the benefits of conservation moorings, is it will make it more hospitable for
It
oysters.
probably will.
And it will also, it probably won't reduce the nitrogen reflux from the bottom, but it may reduce the amount of additional nitrogen from the dissolved and whatnot that's in the sediment from getting up into the water column. And one of the key water quality parameters is suspended and floating solids, et cetera, and it's going to knock that down.
Yeah.
So in places like Aries Pond and Meeting House Pond, where you've got suspended solids problems, one of the ways to get at it is conservation moorings.
I agree. That's why it's here. I just want to try.
Our upweller there, won't have a storm or there's a lot of boat activity because we have our pump is floating on a dock. It goes up and down with the tide. This way it doesn't get down into the muck, but the muck comes up to the pump. And we get the muck, and the silt comes into the upweller. It doesn't seem to bother the oysters. Now, remember, it comes in and it's in the bottom and it's an upweller. So I don't know how much is getting into the silos themselves, but certainly once a week we have a nice layer of silt.
And we clean our
Mayonnaise comes in.
Yeah. So
It doesn't seem to bother them.
right. Okay. Good to know. And that project's been going very well. I mean, the oysters definitely grow.
So you have 28 kilograms of nitrogen from fertilizer and stormwater, so I'm wondering what assumptions you used.
The 25%.
And were there projects identified in the watershed?
Haven't got that far. Put a few more oysters in. But that is, I think we have to talk about how to handle the actual ground truthing of stormwater.
I'd like to comment on all these ponds. I think we need some ground truthing with people who operate marinas and other commercial entities in these ponds. I happened to look out on Town Cove, and there's not much of the surface of Town Cove that's not used by somebody for recreation, boating, clamming, whatever, in a year. I mean, there's a tremendous use of that surface, from kayaks to water skiers to you name it.
And in Town Cove, we don't have any floating gear. I have not. We're looking at Aries Pond right now.
I'm just saying.
Yep. Absolutely.
Think about that
Absolutely. Totally agree. Moving on, Lonnie's Pond. Lonnie's Pond is very interesting. This is where the permeable reactive barrier solution is being proposed. And I actually have the floating constructed well. And if the PRB doesn't make it for whatever reason, the other experiment that could be done here is a floating constructed wetland. Lonnie's Pond is a great little terminal pond that's got a fairly small nitrogen reduction goal. So it's a great experimental platform for either looking at a floating constructed wetland, and you'll see the size, and even if it's twice that, it's not a very busy, crowded basin, and I don't have a picture of it, but there's ringing around it is places where these floating wetlands would sort of blend in. But it's also a great PRB location as well. This is the storm water system, and that has absolutely been identified. And this is the cranberry bog. And one of the things that we're thinking is that you could do stormwater remediation, because that cranberry bog floods and goes right in through a 12-inch pipe into the pond. And so Stantec is actually looking at what you could do to remediate that, and that is the exact stormwater and fertilizer load that we're talking about in this particular sub-watershed. So we didn't do that for Aries. We did do it for Lonnie's.
Was this was this a trench or was it a well type of PRB?
So that's a great question. It is very shallow. We've got the depth to groundwater, and the road is shallow. You could probably do this with a trench. But again, you'd want to decide. So we've heard your comments about PRBs, and I think taking this forward, we'll have to think about how to handle that.
And the question about whether a trench, people feel better about a trench than they do about a well. And if that changes calculation because you're not injecting substance.
You happier with the trench in the road?
You mean the wood chip trench?
It's
When I looked at those pictures of Falmouth with the red beaches and all of the iron released and shellfish gone from anywhere in front of that project, to
That was
me,
too close. It was
yeah,
too close.
bad.
This is
Not a good plan.
not that. No, I know. I live there. Believe me.
Yeah. But
Meeting.
looking at this, I wonder about having that discharge pipe from the cranberry bog discharge onto a floating wetland, or maybe that's what you were talking about.
It's the other side. Discharge site is.
Yeah, it's right there.
And the floating wetlands way over here.
Yeah, so move it.
You can move it to the other side.
Move to the other side.
Sure.
And have the discharge not go directly into a pipe into
But
the
go
water,
into-
but go instead on top of a floating constructed wetland to
Yep.
take up whatever nutrients are
Yep.
coming out of the bog. Or do two.
Or do both. But one at a time, so you can have a control and a variable
Yes.
and run your experiment, know what you're doing. All right, Meeting House, and I'm moving right along. This is a much more significant, so look at these two numbers. Reduction target, 193 kilograms. Reduction target, 1,600 kilograms. This is a much bigger problem. And that is why I think the alternatives in Aries and Lonnie's really make a lot of sense, because they're small targets. In this particular case, we've got a laundry list of activities to get to that full removal number. Fertilizer and stormwater, PRBs, some coastal habitat restoration, some floating constructed wetlands, aquaculture, and at the end of the day, 42 eco-toilets and 36 IA systems. The astounding part to me was that when Judy and her husband took us on a trip on Friday through all of Pleasant Bay, and it was the most informative, and I just want to thank her publicly for this, taking the day, and Gary and I went out, and she showed us around, and most of the pictures that you see here are her handiwork, except for the ones of the storm drain, which we took. But we were able to ground truth. The whole point of saying all that was that we were able to go through, and those particular locations are real places where things like this fit. And that was really important, because I heard from the meeting before that there's boating, there's activity, there's lots of kayaking, there's not a section that's not unused, but there are a few little corners. So this is what we've got. This is a busy boat area. And we also think that the PRB would capture some of the future growth, which is not insignificant in Meeting House Pond. And the conservation moorings would do a lot for that sediment, which we already talked about. Namaquat has much smaller. Namaquat is smaller in terms of its nitrogen reduction. And so what I originally proposed is a few floating constructed wetlands. That is another place where you could do that kind of an experiment to see if they're going to work as advertised. And the other possibility is, when I took another look at this after driving around, there's a very interesting location for another PRB that's even farther away from the shoreline than the one at Lonnie's Pond. So that picture on the right here, this picture, is there in, that's actually from Poche, and that is really what I would envision one of your floating constructed wetlands actually looking like. Pawa, we talked about this one, another small reduction target. We've got fertilizer, stormwater, haven't been ground, don't know if there's real stormwater improvements that can be made. And the solution here was the PRB. And there are 2 areas already that I could see for coastal habitat restoration if the PRB falls off the table. And it's a small mucky bottom as well. And that picture on the lower right is of one of the areas that I would envision some habitat restoration being possible. Pochi is very shallow, and as we talked about, has some soft shell and razor clams already growing wild, and I think would be a very useful place to look at a reef. And when I say reef, I don't mean some big structure necessarily, but just having wild oysters and wild species growing. And the way you would test this, we actually saw, we all got very excited because right around the inlet there's an area where there's a little bit of fresh water coming in, but it looked like it had some really nice sandy bottom that looked like a oyster aquaculture reef type development, and about ½ an acre would fit right there and could work. The way you test this is you get trays and you put some spat on shell, which is also called culch, where so you've got oysters sitting on pre-made substrate, and you'd grow them for a season and you'd see if they lived. And so you could test it out that way. Quonset, little, very crowded in the outer. I think there's little and big Quonset. Is that how you differentiate between this upper area here and then the main basin?
Yes.
So little. So I would say a little oyster reef and little Quonset would be a really interesting experiment to try. The river. I got to eat my lunch watching the river today, and there's the upper river and the lower river, and they both have moderate targets. And for there, we're looking at coastal habitat restoration and aquaculture, and along the edges. You know, there's a channel, and then there's outside the channel, and it seemed to us as we were looking, as you go way outside the channel, kind of near the shoreline, there's room to put some natural systems. And so that's what we were looking at, and that's where those little, and you have them on printout, so you can go study these tonight. Tell me tomorrow what's wrong. There are I think the point is there are some physical locations where you could put the kinds of acreage that we're talking about, and we'd want to find out how people in the area felt about that, but I got some feedback. We got some feedback today that people like their bivalves, which is good to hear. And there's already cohogs and steamers growing. We want to manage it a little better so that we could control predation. And I wanted to point out that Kents Point is town-owned. Back in the 90s, it was proposed to have some sort of a land-based aquaculture activity there, and it was shot down by the Conservation Commission. So that happened in the 90s. But the land is still public, and the water's in front. So this is Kents Point right here. And so I have a little aquaculture that would be probably ground-based proposed there. Town Cove. Are we going to end with Town Cove? I think we're going to get through Town Cove and the ponds. Permeable reactive barriers, again, far away. So Town Cove is interesting because both of these areas would not have the permeable reactive barrier in Falmouth was in the sand on the beach. And what happened was there wasn't time underground because the water started coming up, and the iron started to recombine at the surface. And so the idea is you want to have a minimum of 100 feet away from the water body, and you don't get that recombination at the surface. It happens in the soil where it is happening right now. And so another feature of all of these PRBs that I've cited is that they have that buffer. I mean, because I'm aware of what happened in Falmouth. So this is even farther away. So these are 2 PRBs, and then these are the areas, somebody mentioned there's a lot of conflicting activity, but these are pretty small areas in Town Cove. And we've got lots of different measures because it's an enormous reduction target. So you got to bring out the big guns if you're going to get rid of all that with traditional.
Is 117 homes with eco toilets realistic, for this level?
I think the downtown area should be maybe use traditional. I'm not supposed to say that. I mean, we're gonna be practical. We're gonna move to a hybrid. The whole point is to have a hybrid, but to show that if you're gonna look, and this is what you'd have to do to get there practically with non-traditional, and whether it's realistic is a different question.
See, there's as I recall, the 208, Cape Cod Commission PRBs had it running into Eastham, and are you going to look at the Eastham, because that's part of the same watershed, and presumably, that's an incentive to do it on a regional basis and see what the benefits are for a regional system.
I think a PRB running the entire length of Tonset and 6A isn't particularly practical. And part of it is because there are some high-density areas and low-density areas. And so the places where we picked the PRB here was because this is where the catchment area got you the most bang for the buck in terms of
Yeah, no, my
residences.
question isn't about the technique you use. It's about
employing
employing the technologies in Eastham. That's my question.
What we assumed for the for our planning purposes, what we assumed is the 208 plan for Eastham is the non-traditional bookend for us. I didn't modify what the Cape Cod Commission came up with for Eastham's non-traditional bookend. It is incorporated into this. Did I say that right?
Why not?
We're fixing Eastham.
So this reduction
We're
target
fixing
is for both
Eastham.
towns?
Yeah, exactly. No, I guess the question is why? Why did you not apply the non-traditional technologies to Eastham?
Well, it's not that we won't, it's that we need actually to engage Eastham and to a lesser degree Brewster on this more actively in terms of laying these things out for those towns, especially Eastham, both on the traditional and the non-traditional. We will have to have a plan that deals with the watershed as a whole. But at this point here, we focused on Orleans, and Orleans specifically, with plans to talk to Eastham about the types of technologies that would work in those areas. But we have not done that yet.
Is the 5739 the total requirement for the
That's the
watershed,
that
or
is the-
just Orleans?
That's the total watershed requirement.
So what you've done is taken all of it out of Orleans?
Yeah.
If I could just remind folks, this is an alternative that we're not being.
We can't hear you.
Speak up, please.
This is an alternative that we're not going to
It's not
implement.
going to be implemented. This is a scenario that basically adds up everything you need on the buffet menu in order to achieve the target. So, like Mike says, there will be some engagement with Eastham and Brewster as well for a hybrid solution. But this is just one scenario that gets us to the target. There are many other scenarios that will get us to the target.
And if you would like to have a PRB in Eastham, that's how we could modify this bookend. But that's the point is I've held up something, and the hope is to get you guys helping to modify it.
I just want to say on that, there is the question of should the plans that we're making address 100% of the required solution when Orleans is not 100% of the contributor to the problem.
Sure.
That's a very valid question, and I think we need to. I know you might love that, but so I think that's a valid question, and I think we need to think about that as we're even looking at the next iteration of these bookends.
So we can fix it all and just let them pay for it.
Right.
We're just giving,
Works for us.
Which is a possibility.
Sure.
Or a share of the,
Okay, the downtown area is the next one I want to talk about. The solution for the downtown area, because it is so dense and because the lots are so small, is basically keeping the existing IA systems that are in place, adding eco toilets where we have to, and upgrading Tri-Town to continue to accept septic, because when you have IAs and eco toilets, you have to have a place for the septic. And so that's all the other alternatives are part of town code, but the downtown area, just wanted to highlight, is particularly an area where the IAs and the eco toilets are being targeted in this non-traditional bookend. And so, again, the whole point of this was to find out how you'd like me to change it based on your thinking and your understanding. I'm going to get through the last of these, and then I think one thing that would be really helpful is you have these, you have the descriptions of them from last week, you have the technology description, and it's perfectly a good idea, I think, to have you feeding back to Stacy what you would like to see change in these. So Mill Pond, we noticed that there is not an actual target, so there's not a watershed target for it listed in an MEP report. So we don't have a specific number, but we are looking at it as a potential for, there's plenty of aquaculture going in there right now, so we thought aquaculture could be something that would help water quality. It's currently a relay site. The town is currently relaying oysters and quahogs. It's got a deep basin. From the MEP report, it talked about the dissolved oxygen not being too high, but the chlorophyll being very high, which is speaks to a great feeding ground for shellfish. And so we wanted to include Mill Pond. And then there's 3 more: Crystal and Pilgrim Lake, phosphorus problem. And one of the things I wanted to I'm going to highlight is this idea of a pond circulator. And I've asked a few engineers what they think about pond circulators, and we all sort of shrug our shoulders and say, might work, might not work. We're looking at one in Falmouth for one of our very low salinity ponds. And, there seems like there's some great reasons to look at the idea of oxygenating using some aeration system. But then what kind of problems are you creating on the other side? So the jury's a little bit still out on it. I did want to also mention that, let me get this straight, Pilgrim has a herring run to Lonnie's Pond. It is the most beautiful area. I'm sure you all have seen it. It is just fabulous. And it's out in a different sub-watershed than our PRB. So who knew? And so there's this hydro connection there, and then the cranberry bog is the other. What is it? Crystal provides the water to the cranberry bog that's also going into Lonnie. So we got to see some of that. Phosphorus being the problem, and urine diverting toilets. You don't even need the full composting toilets. Remove a lion's share of the phosphorus. It is unbelievable. I've been looking at the numbers just last week, and they remove about 60, 70%, 50, 60, 70% of the nitrogen, but you get phosphorus numbers down to, I want to say, 0.2 milligrams per liter. It's a huge reduction from urine diverting toilets to get rid of phosphorus. Just an FYI, and that's why they're being promoted in an area that's phosphorus limited.
You've got the reduction target as phosphorus. Have you got any numbers?
There is not a number.
There is no number?
No, there is not. Bowl and Pond, again, it's phosphorus. If there were a number, I would have put it in here. Yeah. Same story. Phosphorus limited. And I thought this was the greatest picture. Somebody in the beginning, we said, well, with MEP reports, we're not quite sure. I have to say a picture is worth 1,000 words. We may not know exactly how many kilograms we have to remove, but when you see that kind of macroalgae growing and when you're close to it, you've got to do something. And I think the whole point of this is not to get caught up in how many, is it 10 kilograms or 20 kilograms, but it's to say adaptive management will show us the rest. Maybe shouldn't go there.
That is WMO 10 sampling station for the MEP in the river.
Yep. We did it.
Yes.
60 slides.
So I'm going to need you guys to send input, comments, thoughts on these specific, we're at the specific site base here. Send them to me. And they're not going to feed into the next meeting, because the next meeting we're going back to look at the traditional. But they will feed in as we take this one forward don't know whether we're gonna have another meeting just on these. I think we're gonna mostly be bringing them into the hybrid. Yes, I know. But first, any final comments from the panel before I open for public comment? Yes.
Just a question about the dredging that's starting to occur, I think today in Rock Harbor. Is there a time that we should be doing some benthic coring or testing there before it gets all disturbed and dredged? Too late. Maybe not.
I think you should, to figure out how much is washing out of the marsh, if you can, into the focus.
Is it?
It's already been.
It's only been started on one side.
Two huge dredges are set, I was there this morning, 2 huge dredges are set up and
They
they're
are,
scoping out.
they are, but they're set up on one side and working on one side.
Both sides.
Ah, okay. Well,
Anything else on the panel? Okay, public comments, anything else? All right, see you guys on the 22nd. It's going to be morning meeting again.
Move to adjourn?
Second.
All right, done.
Thank you.